at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. I have been working at the school for 3 years. My area of expertise is conflict analysis and conflict resolution. Before moving to Singapore, I was actually based in New York, where I was a director of a think tank called International Peace Institute, which works with the United Nations on the resolution of violent conflict. I mainly worked in the Middle East region. I was a special assistant of the special envoy in Lebanon for the United Nations. And I worked quite a bit in West Africa as well. So the Middle East is a part of the world where I lived and worked for many years before moving to Southeast Asia. And so we felt maybe it was a good idea to tap into my expertise to have a conversation around what is happening in that part of the world. So our catchy title here is the Middle East Explained, but obviously I have no ambition to explain the Middle East in 45 minutes, but we felt it was a catchy title. And the idea, what I would like to do with you, let's say for 20 minutes before answering some questions, is to give you more a sort of a map, sort of a framework to understand the different challenges of the region and the different conflicts. I think most of you are probably familiar with a lot of the things that are happening in the Middle East because you read about them. But a lot of these are piecemeals and not really connected with each other. So we'll try to connect, and we will try to say a few things that cut across the region. And then I'm obviously very open to answer a specific question on specific countries or specific conflict. Now, a good way to start generally when we talk about a part of the world is to show a map. So the light countries are what we call, in this case, Middle East and North Africa. I wanted to include, let me zoom in, I wanted to include also Egypt and Libya and Tunisia because of the inevitable connections with a lot of the things that happened in the last years, but also throughout decades of history in the region. North Africa is very much connected to the Middle East. So you cannot talk about the Middle East without talking also about North Africa. As I was mentioning, obviously you are aware of a lot of the things that are happening in the Middle East. You, of course, heard about the Arab unrest in 2011, 2012. You, of course, have heard about the conflict in Syria, about foreign intervention in conflicts in the Middle East. I'm sure you also heard about rivalries between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And then obviously you heard about ISIS and terrorism, the refugee crisis, and many other issues that are somehow percolating across the whole region. Now the challenge is that the media focus on breaking news, and policymakers focus on the crisis of the day. And so at the end, you only have one little piece of the conversation at the time. But my key message is that to understand the Middle East, you need to see it as intersecting clusters of issues, because all these different crises that I just mentioned are deeply interrelated with each other, and to understand one, you need to understand the other, not to mention to try to solve one, you need also to address the other. Now, before going to the clusters of issues, I wanted to give you a sort of what I call a sort of a mental framework when it comes to analyze the Middle East. There are 3 layers of complexity that has to be taken into consideration. The first is history. You cannot really talk about the Middle East without understanding the history. This is not because we need to focus on the past, but because the past is shaping the present and the future in very substantive way. And so, in other words, you cannot really understand the unraveling of today's order in the Middle East without understanding where it's coming from, without understanding how all the system was set up during the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, how the Arab nationalism had a role in unraveling eventually and creating dynamics that fed into, for example, more Islamic radicalization. Obviously, two big earthquakes in the region, the 1948 creation of the State of Israel, as well as the 1979 Iran Revolution. These are all events that in some way have shaped the region, but continue to have repercussion. So you need to understand history, first layer of complexity. Second layer of complexity, you need to understand the evolution, the new dynamics, the new. For example, what happened during 2011, 2012 has dramatically reshaped the landscape of the Middle East, with some regime change, like in Tunisia, with some collapse of regime, like in Libya and Syria and Yemen, or some transitions with upheavals, such as in Egypt. The invasion of Iraq, for example, by the American and the US coalition, which has reshaped the map also, creating a new dynamic between Iran and Iraq, and also feeding into the rise of Iran. And obviously one of the latest events, which was the Iranian nuclear deal. We will say a little more about this. The third layer of complexity to understand is what I label foreign intervention. This part of the world has been a constant playground for major powers, declining powers, rising powers, intervening in domestic affairs, in regional affairs at all levels. You cannot understand the domestic dynamics without also understanding the regional and international layers. So these three layers of complexity need to be taken into consideration every time you think about a crisis in the Middle East. And to add a little bit of complexity, this is not just about dates and facts, because what is very relevant in this part of the world are the perceptions and the narratives. What is perceived by one country is very different than from another. The way narratives are constructed domestically change in dramatic ways. It doesn't really matter if you believe or not that there is an Iranian resurgent and an attempt to dominate the region. This is how it is perceived in most of the majority Sunni country, and that becomes a reality. So perception and narratives are very important. It's not just about dates and facts. Now, let me get to the cluster of challenges. And I think we can summarize all the different challenges in three mega clusters: geopolitical changes, political instability, and what I call radicalism. Let me say something about each of them before bringing everything together. So the first cluster is what I call geopolitical changes. I think the rise of Iran is one of the key factors. And this, of course, is due to multiple events. I think the Iran nuclear deal, it's something that has definitely shaped the politics of the region in the last few years. Why is that? Well, because obviously, if we move toward a normalization of Iran in global affairs, Iran will have more space to operate. Iran is obviously a very big country, 80 million people, with a functioning economy, very well educated citizenship. So there is a lot of potential there. And obviously that creates concern from the other traditional regional power, which is Saudi Arabia. The collapse also of Saddam Hussein in Iraq has also shaped the dynamics, because Iraq has been historically sort of the counterbalance with Iran. But now an Iraq that is Shia dominated has shifted the balance of power in that part of the world as well. So all this interplays in a big way in the geopolitics of the region. Another big challenge, I think, in terms of the geopolitics is a huge arms race, which is happening in the region. And because obviously of these rivalries. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and other Gulf states have been involved in major arms race. In the last few years, Gulf country has spent over 100 billion in dollars in arms order that are now in the process of delivery. This is mainly to modernize the army rather than expand the army. Saudi Arabia, for example, has placed as one of the largest arm order of the past 2 decades with 154 F-15 aircrafts, and also signed approximately $15 billion arms deal with Canada. It's also possible that the easing of sanctions may give Iran access to more advanced weaponry, and we know that China has been visiting the region, been in Tehran. There is a possibility for future procurement of Chinese armaments as well. So that's definitely a big trend in the region, which is also shifting the geopolitical balance. Let me now quickly move into the challenge of political instability. Now, obviously, the Arab uprising, what was called the Arab Spring of 2011-2012, has dramatically changed the political landscape. If the trigger was, particular events in each of the countries, there were obviously what I would call root causes, which are mainly socio-economic. And the reality is that most of the socio-economic crises have not been really addressed. And so I would make an argument that the underlying reason of the uprising have not been addressed and resolved. So the region domestically remain very unstable. One of the factors of this instability is demographics. Population growth have been dramatic in this part of the world. This is the last 60 years increases, and you can see the numbers. We're talking about increases that are very hard to sustain, even for very developed economies. But when it comes to this part of the world, some of these countries have limited economic capacities. In fact, there are high level of unemployment, which is obviously also driving political instability. Half of the population of the Arab world is under 25, and the youth unemployment rates are roughly 50% against the global average of 13%. And as we're talking about unemployment, let me say something about the economy in the region, which is to me is another factor of instability. Each country has different set of problems. Oil-rich countries like Saudi Arabia have been definitely suffering from low oil prices. They've been holding their market share, but they've been hurting their finances. Saudi Arabia is also set to run approximately $5 to $6 billion deficit a month. And we have to remember that 75% of their economy is from oil. Obviously very aware of this problem, and in fact they have an economic plan the economy of the country. Now, 2/3 of the workforce in the Gulf region operates in the public sector. And for example, in Saudi Arabia, 80% of the employees in the private sector are foreigners. In Qatar, this percentage is close to 99%. So these are very hard numbers to sustain in the future. Non-oil-rich countries like Egypt or Jordan or Lebanon have massive unemployment and also serious problem with the quality of services, of social services. A big issue that I would flag is education. Not because the rate of literacy is a problem, actually is quite high in the region, but it's more the quality of knowledge that has not kept up with the demand of new markets. And that's why you end up with a lot of unemployed young people. And of course, women are scarcely integrated in the societies. This really depends on what country we're talking about, but on average across the region. And it's not only an equality problem, but also a missed opportunity in terms of productivity of the society. And this obviously brings me to the third cluster of issues, which is the one related to radicalism. Now, you heard about ISIS, Sunni versus Shia, sectarianism, and the struggle between secularism and radicalism are really in front of us every day. They really interplay at domestic level as well as at regional. And also, these dynamics influence the happening in a country, influence countries on the other side of the border. Now, ISIS, for example, which is a byproduct of the failed states in Iraq and Syria, is just the latest incarnation of a terrorist group, and this time also with territorial ambitions, of course, very hard to achieve. And I wanted to, actually, I choose this very choreographed photo to show you how their kind of rhetoric and the way they try to appeal to youth, it's not really with the Quran. It looks more like a movie poster. And in fact, most of this radicalization happen online and not certainly in mosques. And so this is a big problem that goes across borders. The last things I want to say on radicalism is that terrorism is something that is mainly affecting countries in the region, as well as other countries with Muslim minorities or majorities. So, for example, Iraq, Pakistan, and Afghanistan are the countries with the most number of attacks, terrorist attacks. So you might have a perception reading the news that most of these terrorist attacks happen in Europe, and that's absolutely not the case. And so this is a massive challenge because it's really deep insecurity in the daily life of a lot of people living in these countries, which is undermining all the other social element, I would say also the social contract between state and citizens. So let me sum up all these different clusters, if I can. We talked a little bit about the geopolitical changes. Obviously, a very fluid dynamics right now in the Middle East, which has been in motion for many years. They've been definitely triggered by the US invasion in Iraq. The Arab Spring then created yet a new opportunity for shifted and changes. Some degenerated into civil wars, like in Libya or in Yemen or in Syria. And these civil wars actually further degenerated into regional wars and even into internationalized wars. The rise of Iran, the tensions between Iran and Saudi Arabia is giving a flavor to most of this conflict. The dynamics in Syria are mainly influenced by this competition. In Yemen, in a similar way. In Libya, where actually the conflict is more about resource control, still there is a tendency to color the confrontation along those lines. The latest confrontation, the boycott of Saudi Arabia, UAE, and other countries of Qatar, has to be read within this lens. Yet, another struggle because of Qatar sympathies for the Muslim Brotherhood and their open relationship, relatively open relationship with Iran, has put a huge pressure on them from Saudi Arabia, UAE, with a boycott, an embargo, and so on. So all these things have created a very fluid geopolitical change. I would like to add that in the last year, the US administration has also somehow impacted this fluidity. It's, as of now, it looks like that the US administration has gave a sort of a blank check to Saudi Arabia. That has definitely emboldened Saudi Arabia. It's no coincidence that this boycott of Qatar has happened just a few weeks after Trump visited Riyadh. And fueling this tension between Sunni and Shia is something that the US has always tried to avoid and has now instead stepped in and very clearly pointed the finger on Iran and accused of terrorism and other things, which has somehow augmented the tension during 2017. We'll see how these things will play out in 2018, but I'm definitely not very optimistic. The second big cluster of challenges is what I call political instability. When it comes to political instability, I mentioned the domestic fluidity, not to mention the wars in many of these countries. But I also mentioned the fundamentals, the demographics, the youth unemployment, the social services, the lack of employment opportunities. So somehow I would say that the very social contract is under stress in many countries in the Middle East. And I don't see a political movement toward addressing this issue. Maybe Tunisia is the exception. And so this to me means that these problems are here to stay and then can easily degenerate in further tension, protest, and conflict. And finally, we talk about radicalism, the issue of radicalization, which of course has also historical reasons. I mentioned the Iranian Revolution in 1979. That somehow was one of the triggers that pushed Saudi Arabia to shore up their form of Islam, the Wahhabism, and invest billions of dollars to promote that form. For example, the so-called the 6-Day War, which was a war against Israel, which Israel won very quickly against the coalition Arab country, and particularly Egypt. It's also something that created the decline of Arab nationalism and actually created a space for a more sort of radicalized conversation in the Islamic world. So all this dynamic has an influence on what is happening today when it comes to radicalization. And so to sum up, under geopolitical changes, I include the rise of Iran, these shifting alliances, the arms race, political instability, I include the Arab uprising, the demographic and the economics. And under radicalism, the issue of extremism and violent extremism, sectarianism, and also this dynamic between the more conservative and the more progressive, the secular versus the radical, which is play out at domestic level in all countries. And so this is the crisis triangle. And it is within this crisis triangle that you have to read the multiple issues and crises in the region. All these factors play out in Libya, in Syria, in Iraq, in Palestine, in Yemen, with ISIS, in the example that I made of the Saudi UAE boycott of Qatar, in the Israeli-Arab conflict, and the Arab-Persian tensions. And I use the word Persian because that's something that you sometimes hear when you go in the Gulf countries, this idea of Persian hegemony, this idea that, the Persian are back kind of idea. And again, it's very much also about perception and how these things are perceived. Let me say one word about the Israeli-Arab conflict. And the Israeli-Arab conflict has been a conflict that has shaped the dynamics in the region for decades. And it's actually interesting to observe that today is not the central conflict anymore. It has become a cluster of conflicts that all influence each other. But there's been less emphasis on resolving, for example, the Israeli-Palestinian issue. And from my point of view, the Middle East peace process is kind of stuck, and it's not really going anywhere, despite some of the, public declaration. And that is precisely because there is less political pressure on that because of Syria, because of Yemen, because of Iran, and so on and so forth. So somehow the Palestinian issue has been, how can I say, sort of a victim of these shifting dynamics. Now, I want to reconnect what I said here in the crisis triangle with the original mental framework that I mentioned to you. So when you read all these things, don't forget the old, so don't forget history, don't forget the new dynamics, and don't forget the external factors, external interventions, players, influence, and so on and so forth. And of course, don't forget that it's all about perceptions and narratives and not just simply single events. Okay, I think I'll wrap up here. And okay, so the way it works is that I'm starting to get some questions here, which I'll try to answer orally. So just give me a second that I read the text. I have another computer here. So let me read the first question. So the first question is about internet penetration rate in the region. Will the access and hence the visibility of what happened outside the region help in the integration with the rest of the world? So the internet penetration is actually quite good. And there's been even people saying that the Arab uprising of 2011, 2012 were actually possible because of the internet connection. I think definitely internet, not internet only, but handphone cameras definitely allowed some of these events to reach beyond borders. And so, for example, the violence, the very beginning of the violence in Syria was filmed and easily and then quickly distributed within a few hours across the border, and that trigger all sorts of reactions. And if you look at past violence, for example, in the country, if you look at when in 1982 Assad's father bombed the city of Hama, still today you don't have photos. It's hard to find photos. That is the fundamental difference between the revolution of the past and the revolutions today. They don't stay contained within the borders. They move across. So internet is a fundamental factor, and I would say potentially also fundamental factor of development and connection. The Middle East is one of the least inter-regional correlated region of the world. Inter-region trade is very low. There are very few, there are basically no train interconnections. For actually Arab citizens, it's very hard to get visa to go from one country to the other. So interconnection is actually not very good, and internet could obviously provide that. So I'm quite helpful, and I tend to think that internet is more a force for good rather than for evil, or for, obviously there are people manipulating that as well. Second question is China. Now India has progressed well in the standard of living and freedom and so on. Do you see the region following the similar path? Well, you see, the big difference that I see between China and India and the Middle East is that these two big countries actually have political stability. They have political challenges, but overall, they have political stability. This is something that unfortunately has been very hard to achieve in the Middle East, and even in those countries where there's been a continuity in terms of the leadership. Think about Yemen, for example, where President Saleh was in power for like 35 years. Still, he was plagued by civil wars constantly, separatism in the country. There was never really peace in Yemen, even with a very stable, if you want, regime. And so personally, I think that this political instability had definitely undermined the economic and social potential of the region, which, as I mentioned, overall very well educated people, level of literacy is very high. So all the numbers are there. But unfortunately, the political has taken a toll on the economic. And so you probably would need to work first on that political angle to achieve that kind of increase in the standard of living. A third question is regarding the conflict between Shia and Sunni, and how this conflict and tension between Shia and Sunni can have impact in other parts of the world, and particularly in Asia. I think it definitely can have an impact, and it does have an impact. We haven't included Pakistan and Afghanistan in our analysis, but obviously they're also part of the dynamics. I personally think that Pakistan has been, Pakistan society has been deeply shaped by Saudi Arabia investment and Wahhabism there. So there is definitely an outreach. Southeast Asia, I think that Saudi Arabia is obviously a presence in terms of investment and economic connection, somehow has been a little less successful in shaping the Islamic thinking and doctrine. And I think it's because of geographical difference, but also distance, but also because of sort of doctrinal differences. With that said, we have seen some dynamics toward more conservatism and radicalization. So potentially, the more Sunni radicalization is something that could have an impact in this part of the world. Although I don't think it will bring to the level of confrontation that is happening today. And the reason is because, you see, this is not really about religion. Religion is just used for as a political proxy and as a regional dominance proxy. This is a dynamics very hard to export in Southeast Asia, but it's obviously very alive in the Middle East. Another question is, what are my recommendations for promoting peace in the region? And what is the best case scenario for peace in the region? This is the $1 million question. I am unfortunately rather pessimistic in these days. I don't feel that there is a political space for peaceful resolution of conflict at this stage. What I mean by that is the political stars are basically not aligned. Let's just take one example, which is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the peace process. I don't see a domestic incentive in Israel to actually get serious about it. The role of the United States has now become even more controversial than before, with the move of the plan of moving the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem. And Abbas, who was actually at the UN a couple of days ago, basically is refusing to recognize the U.S. role as a mediator any longer. And is invocating the European Union, or what is called the Quartet, which also include the Russia and UK, to play a role. But the divisions that there are between, for example, Russia and the United States are insurmountable. There is actually very little agreement between these two powers on how to solve any of these conflicts, which is one of the reasons also why violence continues in Syria. So my recommendation at this stage is, first of all, is to avoid to do harm. If I may express an opinion, I think it's very irresponsible to go to the region today and feed into the sectarianism. I don't think anybody should promote. There is enough tension. And to me, when President Trump, for example, goes to Riyadh and is actually feeding into that narrative, it's not helpful. It's not helpful. For anybody from outside the region, the main task should be actually to try to calm down, to try to find the points of contact rather than feeding that kind of rhetoric. The second challenge is that, unfortunately, most of the people intervening in the Middle East always feel that the use of force is the main tool, because they always approach problem from a security perspective. And you see, when the only thing you have is force, everything going to look like a security problem. But the reality is that things like ISIS, for example, yes, of course, are a security problem because they're killing people. But it's fundamentally a political problem of territorial control. Not coincidentally, ISIS has been proliferating in all areas where there is basically no government presence, like the northeast of Syria, like the south of Yemen, where basically governance is extremely weak. It feeds into social and economic dynamics. And so, you know, if you read everything as a security problem, then of course you're going to use force. But the reality is a lot of these are social, economic problems. Looks like political instability is holding everything back. Do you see any leaders or political parties? Thanks. It's a good question. I really hate to come out too negative here, but I have a hard time to see sort of a new emerging leadership. Now, obviously, what is happening in Saudi Arabia is extremely interesting. In the last few months, we have seen news that a few years back would have sound like fake news in terms of women empowerment, changing of basic customs, like even celebrating Valentine's Day, which was not really the case in the past, opening up the economy, and obviously the big anti-corruption operation, whatever you want to call it. So there's a lot that is happening there. Potentially very interesting in terms of perspective for the future. There is obviously a strong economic pressure that can dramatically transform the Saudi society. But it's very hard now, from where we sit, to be able to predict anything and to see where this direction will go. The reality is that most of the leaders in charge still tend to have a fairly authoritarian approach to government. There's very little bottom-up, very little sort of stakeholder engagement. It's all very top-down. And so all the things that we've seen happening, for example, in Southeast Asia, in this part of the world, in many countries, are not really happening. And I think it's because of lack of leadership. Now, Tunisia, to me, remains the most interesting case, where obviously power sharing has been one of the most successful examples. And I think, somehow Tunisia is self-contained, has been able to protect itself from other dynamics. It's also geopolitically less relevant. And so that's, it's kind of a lucky thing to have in the Middle East. But it's an interesting case to study, to look how civil society organizations, lawyers, labor, and others were actually able to create a sort of a new social compact. And these were all forces that were already present in the past, but they've just been able to kind of reshape themselves. And also somehow accept the idea that there are Islamic parties in the Arab society. They have influence, and they can be legitimate players in politics. And so something that has to be accommodated. And so I think, is an interesting example to study. How do you see Saudi Arabia emerging from all of this? Part with issues like the ongoing war in Yemen, the rise of in Iran, etc. Yeah. Well, and I was saying before, I think for Saudi Arabia, it's a huge challenge ahead. The fundamentals there. I mean, obviously, Saudi Arabia is still a very rich country, but I already mentioned, they're running big deficit. They're spending a lot of money in Yemen with very little return. They have, a fairly small population, approximately 20, 24 million people. Almost half of the society, women are not integrated, not productive in the society. Most of the people are employed in public sector. The economy is heavily dependent on oil. it's a huge challenge. Diversifying the economy is a huge challenge, even just for geographical, territorial reason. However, there is a lot of movement, there's a lot of thinking, things are moving not very fast economically, but there is, I think, the political will to address that. And so this big transformation is one of the things to watch, because the last things you want in the Middle East right now is instability in Saudi Arabia. And so you really want to hope that this transformation is managed properly, and the Saudi Arabia will, within 20 years, be a very different country from the one that we think right now. If that happens, the hope is here that Iran becomes more acceptable, because there is less sort of existential threat, let's say. And there is a way to hopefully create some kind of economic cooperation. I think the economic angle is the one to work at this level, but it's too early at this stage because Iran is still perceived mainly as a threat. And of course, Iran is also operating as a threat in many fronts, with a lot of proxies in Lebanon, in Syria, in Yemen, complicating all the conversation. Okay, well, that's what I got as questions. So I have to say thank you. I enjoyed doing this. Actually, this somehow for me was a kind of a warm-up, because in mid-March, I'm actually starting a course online on policy coherence for sustainable development. This is something that we're doing with the school in collaboration with the UN System Staff College and the Hertie School of Governance in Berlin. So if any of you are interested, take a look at our website or our social media. You will see this new course coming up, Policy Coherence for Sustainable Development. And if any of you are interested, I encourage you to register for it. Thank you very much for your time. It's been a pleasure. And have a good day or evening, wherever you are. Bye-bye.